The reading today is from Galatians chapter 5, starting at verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. But by faith, we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. You are running a good race. Who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion doesn't come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion will pay the penalty, whoever he may be. Brothers, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Morning, church. It's lovely to see you this morning. If you're visiting, you're really welcome. It's lovely to have you with us this morning. My name's Paul. I'm one of the ministers here. I'm looking around. Lots of faces I don't recognise. Some people may not recognise me, but I recognise them. I have some of the Pattersons' grandchildren recommended as potential friends on Facebook because of your grandparents. So there you go. It's lovely. We're journeying through the book of Galatians. If you're visiting today, you may have picked that up. And we're coming towards, not quite, but nearly at the end of it. Now, more and more organisations adopt catchphrases or mottos. You start to see them a lot on advertising. Indeed, they're used a lot as advertising tools for those organisations. They're supposed to define what the company's about, something of their values and standards, or what they're trying to sell. So maybe as a warm-up for this Friday's quiz night, we'll try some out on you. No shouting out, hands up. Apparently you're not allowed to do that as a teacher any longer, hands up. So my wife tells me, as a primary school teacher, she's thinking, well, that just encourages them to shout out, which I tell them to stop when I go into school assemblies. That's why I'm not. I often reflect. I think if I was a primary school teacher, I'd end up in prison. So, can you identify these organisations by their catchphrases? Every little helps. Tesco, and we're shouting out already. Well done, Tesco's. And of course they adopted that long before a cost of living crisis, so actually it's served them well, maybe, that catchphrase. Just do it. Hilary? Nike, that's right. This one's really easy, I think. Finger licking good. Robin? It is, it's KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, thank you very much. This one, I think we've all heard of, but I think this is where it falls down sometimes. Can you take the catchphrase and still associate it with the product? Because if you can't do that, the catchphrase is nigh on useless. And I know this catchphrase, but I had to look up what it actually was selling. So maybe the catchphrase isn't that good. It does exactly what it says on the tin. Oh, someone's good, but you're shouting out again. Ron Seal, yeah, Ron Seal. I thought, because that's quite a common phrase now. It's almost been adopted as a phrase in the English language. It just says what it does. It does what it says on the tin. Well, actually, it's selling Ronseal, and I knew the phrase, but I couldn't associate it with the product because I'm worth it. Carol? It is L'Oreal. Yeah. This one I found a little bit more tricky. Some of you may not. Good things come to those that wait. Oh, go on then, Lee. Heinz tomato ketchup. Okay, well, we'll try that again. Good things come to those who wait. And the answer isn't Heinz tomato ketchup, all right? Okay. Well, that's not the company I've got listed. It is Guinness. Well done, Victoria. It's Guinness. Because it takes a long time for it to settle and go black and white. And actually, with squeezy bottles, it doesn't take us long any longer, does it, with ketchup? The best a man can get. Gillette. Well, I'm wondering if you associate this, freedom in Christ, with the book of Galatians. I would suggest that is certainly the strapline for this letter. It's the purpose of Paul's writing. It's the culmination of what he's trying to talk about when he writes this letter to the church in Galatia. This is what he's writing about. It's the reoccurring theme, and he talks about it in so many different ways. He starts to expand the Old Testament, and he starts to talk about the promise of Abraham and the children of Abraham and the children of Hagar, and he unpacks it that way. And then he goes again on this one. Well done, Keith. I think you had some great. You finished on a great line. We might come to that. So this is the summit, really, of this letter. It's the focal point at the moment. It's what Paul is trying to communicate. It's the repetition of this theme throughout his letter. But in this chapter, and of course, if you know anything about the structure of New Testament Greek, you'll realize that the chapters were added later. They were not, Paul didn't write chapters in his letter, because who writes chapters in a letter? That's not how it was structured. But this was broken down into chapters. Chapter 5 begins with, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." He repeats the word. One's a verb, one's a noun. Freedom and free. And in doing so, he's really trying to make a point. It's for freedom that Christ has set you free. And he's talking to a majority Gentile audience that has been heavily influenced by Jewish culture, which is why he's writing this, because the Jewish Christians have come to them. There was this new messianic movement that came out of the Jewish faith about Jesus, and it starts to spread very quickly into the Gentile world. The Gentiles take it and embrace it, great. But the Jews, the Messianic Jews, then start to come and say, no, you must behave like Jews. And of course, when it talks about circumcision, the issue isn't about circumcision. So for the men of the world that are circumcised, that's not what it's really talking about here. It's talking about the rituals that's involved in Jewish practice. It's not specifically talking about circumcision. No, God doesn't have an issue with that in the same way that he has an issue with the ritual behind the practice. That's what this is all about. So he says it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. And there's talk about issues of slavery here, which is really interesting because bearing in mind that we're writing to a church, a Gentile church, heavily or starting to be influenced by Jewish thinking. Let's look at something of the Jewish culture. Let's look at something of the Jewish story. And we know very quickly in the Jewish story, you get through the book of Genesis, in the Jewish history, we see the fathers of the Jewish faith, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the 12 tribes. We very quickly find them in in Egypt, and they become slaves. And by the time you get to the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, you find that these people are slaves. They are literally enslaved to a foreign superpower at the time, Egypt, under Pharaoh. And God sets them free through the great deliverer Moses. He releases them through these 10 plagues that are actually undermining every one of the 10 plagues are sort of significant in the Egyptian gods, and in doing so, Yahweh is saying, the Egyptian gods will bow to me. Every one of them bows to me. Pharaoh is finally succumbs and lets them go. They go. If you know anything about the Jewish story, you realize they're set free. They're free people to be free people. They're set free to be free. They start wandering, and then they go, oh, I wish we were back in Egypt, because at least we had something to eat. And they start talking about cucumbers, which is weird. I mean, who really likes cucumbers that much that you'd want to go back into slavery to get a cucumber? I mean, that's weird. But anyway, they start to talk about this, and they very quickly want to go back and reflect. We wish we were slaves again. Paul is dealing with issues around this. He said, you're set free to be free. You weren't set free to become slaves. You were set free to be free people. So stop trying to enslave yourselves again. And he uses this image, which we don't necessarily understand. It's great Jewish language and imagery. So he talks about a yoke of slavery. And actually that would, for a Jewish reader, you would read that and they go, actually that's mildly offensive. Because the Jewish people wouldn't regard themselves as slaves. They would regard themselves as free people. Bizarrely, even though they were occupied by the Romans at the time, they would regard themselves as free people. God has set them free. But the way that they achieve that freedom is through obedience to the law. But in Jewish culture, the law was often associated with this term, a yoke. You were yoked to the law. And Paul uses that term in a rather negative sense, and actually says you're yoked and in being yoked, you're a slave. So actually the thing that you think is setting you free is actually enslaving you. A yoke is this image of, we all know what a yoke is because we still have them even today. It's a wooden thing that would bind two, usually oxen together or something like that, for the purposes of farming. It would bind two things together so that you're not free to behave independently of the other. If a cow that's yoked to another cow wants to go to the left, well, they both have to agree to go left or they don't go anywhere. That's what it's about, isn't it? So Paul says you're actually yoked to this thing that they're telling you it sets you free, but it's not. It's a form of slavery. And he says, mark my words, listen to me. I'm telling you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, and this is an issue of obedience to Jewish practice, not the practice of circumcision in its sort of clinical sense. This is the practices of Jewish tradition, of circumcision, food laws, and the obedience to the Sabbath. Then you are actually slaves. You're becoming enslaved to this. And Paul starts to unpack this again. Why is this? He said, because if you want obedience, if you choose to adopt these practices and say this is what I'm going to be obedient to the law, then you've got to comply with every single part of it. And if you listen to these Jewish people, but go back in their history, and you'll very quickly find they can't keep any of it. Very quickly. Brief recap of the Jewish story. So there's this delightful, bitter irony with Moses goes up Mount Sinai to get the very law that they're supposed to be obedient to. And in doing so, while Moses is away, the Israelites get a bit panicky and go, well, Moses isn't here. We've got no God to worship. Let's make one. And they make a golden cow and start worshipping it. There's this delightful irony that while Moses is getting the very law that's supposed to set them free, they come back and they find they're worshipping idols. And nobody finds this funny. The Bible is incredibly funny. In a bitter, it's bitter human. It's bitterly sad in one sense, but it's also delightfully funny in another. He says, "This is what you're doing. This the very Jewish story is telling you it can't be done, and yet you think somehow you're going to try it anyway." The very different. Not Einstein had, although he was Jewish, bizarrely. Einstein hadn't yet been born. But he later went on to say the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So stop it. Stop doing it. It's what effectively Paul is saying to them. Stop trying to repeat the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome. It can't be done. He said, you are justified. And this justification is a great New Testament and piece of theology. And it's this word is about being made right with. If you're justified, you're being made right with. And he said, the law will not make you right with God because you can't keep it. What the law will do is will magnify and highlight your areas of sin. And the law effectively becomes like a strict teacher. And says, you must do this, like a really strict teacher. I had a really strict teacher when I was at primary school, Miss Connolly. She was scary. She was an old spinster. And she did not like you. You weren't allowed to move your paper like that when you were handwriting. And she was very particular about handwriting. This was primary school. You couldn't turn your paper like that. It had to be straight on. You had to sit right up. And to stop you moving and leaning over your desk, she had a 30-centimeter ruler, which she sellotaped a compass. Not one of those ones that points north, one of those ones that's used to draw a circle. She sellotaped that to the end, and she would stick it in front of you. So if you leant forward, you got the point of a compass in your head. That's a strict teacher. And she would use the other end of the ruler for rapping your knuckles. The law will do that to you. It's a very strict teacher, Paul says. But Christ set you free through grace. This is the message that I gave to you at the beginning, Paul says. It's a gift of God. You cannot do it yourself. It's a gift of God. Free, completely free. Accept it. Through faith, you are set free. So stop choosing law. Stop choosing rules. So religion, he says, that relies on law keeping is slavery. Paul's already explained why he thinks this, and he reminds them this again. And actually what Paul is saying is, before you became Christians, you were slaves, just like the Jews were once upon a time. You were slaves, but you were slaves to idols. The Gentiles Gentile communities would worship other foreign gods, and he said you were slaves. Christ set you free from that. Free to be free, so stop choosing to go back to becoming slaves again, but slaves to something else other than an idol. You're slaves to the law. So stop it. Choose life. And Paul makes quite a shocking statement here. He then says, look, if you want to pursue this route, then you need to understand this. You actually nullify the cross, the power and the value of the cross. Christ may well not have died, at least in your life, if you want to follow law, because it will be through the law that you will be judged. So in which case, you completely deny the power of the cross. Jesus' death becomes irrelevant to you because it no longer has power in your life because you're choosing a different path. If you choose to be obedient to the law, then you'll be judged accordingly. So Paul is appealing to them to recognize the power of the cross of Christ as being all sufficient, more than enough. Nothing else is required. Pin your hopes on that. Got it? Good. But where there is tension in this, isn't there? We're not you don't have to spend any length of time reading this to see that there is a tension that exists in this. We see it in the book of Hebrews, the book of Philippians. It talks about these tension that exists. But this is an issue of being made right, of being justified, of being, we might talk it of being saved for it. You know, to be saved is to be healed with your relationship with God is, because that's the word soteria means to be healed in Greek. And your relationship with God is being healed through the death of Jesus. That's what this is an issue about. That's what this is dealing. It's not the life of a disciple. There is a difference here. We need to hear that because just because we are free, Paul says, doesn't mean that everything is game on. He says that. Just because you're free doesn't mean everything's an opportunity and everything's available to you. That's not how this works. You are free, you're made right with God through faith alone in Jesus. However, Paul would later go on in other books of the Bible, in Philippians, and then the writer of Hebrews talks about having to strive to enter his rest, the rest that God brings. Seems to be a contradiction. Paul tells the church in Philippi to strive to work out your salvation. Why is that? Is there a contradiction? Because there seems to be Paul is saying, the writer of the Hebrews, saying there is a degree of effort that's required here. There is a work that needs to be done. And yet Paul says here it's not works, it's grace. But they're arguing two different things. There is no tension when you look carefully, there is no tension here. This is a matter, you are saved by grace, but you are a disciple of Christ. The same root word for disciple is found in the word discipline. It's an effort. Jesus says, if you want to be a follower of mine, pick up your cross and follow me. It's costly. Because I want you to live like a disciple. And so that's why I think when we come later, not this year, but next year, as we start to look a little bit about some rules of life, some practicing the way of Jesus, what does it mean to be an apprentice of his? We're going to be starting to talk a little bit about some of these disciplines. And they're not in contradiction to what Paul is writing here in the book of Galatians, in his letter to the church of Galatia. We are free people, free to choose. And this is sort of image, I quite like it. When we're free, God takes us from one place, puts us in another. And imagine the imagery of a shepherd, because that's a good biblical imagery. The shepherd takes his sheep and puts them in this field, and they're free to do whatever they want. And in this field, they can go anywhere they want, but they can't go beyond the barriers of the field. They're safe to play within this. They're safe to do what they want, play. I know sheep play. Whatever. They eat a lot, I know that. But they can move around and do different things, and that's the life of a disciple. We can move around, we can do different things. And the life of a disciple does involve lots of different things, whether that's issues around, keep a day of rest, a Sabbath. It's about spending time with God in silence and solitude. It's about prayer. It's about generosity. It's about hospitality. These are life, and you have to work at them. But you're not slaves to them. Because this is about becoming more like Jesus. And you're never a slave when you're trying to become more like Jesus. That's the growth in freedom. That's the growth of a disciple. And when we come to Jesus, we are set free. We're set free people. And a lot of when we come, we bring things with us. We bring stories from our past. We bring hurts from our past. We bring some of the slavery that we're bound to from the past, whether that's issues around finance, it's issues around image and self-image, it's issues around relationships, it's issues around sex, pornography, addictions, in many different things. We bring these things to the cross of Jesus, and Jesus says, I set you free from them. And sometimes that freedom is instantaneous, sometimes it's a process. Because sometimes it's really hard to give up. That's why they're called addictions, because they're really hard to give up. And Jesus wants to set us free, continually set us free from things. The tense of the verb to be free here, it's the aorist tense. So what that means is it has been done and it is complete. There is nothing else that needs to be done. God's still not working on it. It's done. Literally on a cross, Jesus said the word, not it's done, it's finished. I don't need to do any more. Everything is sorted. That's the power. That's where it lies. And I think there'll be some people today that need to come back to Jesus at that point and ask for that freedom. And there'll be some people, I suspect, that perhaps even here today have yet to really embrace that freedom in their life. They've not really ever turned to Christ. They're still living by rules of a religion of rules and oh, you've got to do this, you've got to behave like that. Well, do you know what? That's not what this is about. That's not how you build the relationship with Jesus, how you come to Jesus, how you be set free. It's not through what you do, it's what through he does. Once you've been set free, he says, great, let's go on a journey. Let's make you better. So what is it today that you need to be set free from? Lou said at the beginning that we're a church that believes in the power of prayer. We do. We've seen it. We've been praying for Sheila here for a while, and she genuinely thought that little stone, which by the way she's not been made into jewelry. It's a bit weird that she could she's made it into a necklace or something. She only thought that was going to have to be operated out because the gland is. I don't know anything about medicine. I'm looking to Bethia, who perhaps does. I'm guessing the gland is not at 1 centimeter wide. Otherwise, I'd be able to put my tongue at the back of my throat and feel the whole of the saliva gland, and I can't. So for a 1 centimeter stone to come out that gland, that's miraculous in itself. God works in mysterious ways. Isn't that the truth? But he is sovereign in his power. We genuinely believe in those two things, that his sovereign power will want to set us free from things, free from pain. And let's say Sheila was in a lot of pain. I can remember when she first got it. Huge amounts of pain. God sets her free. We believe in the power of prayer. And there will be prayer. It's always prayer at Immanuel Church for absolutely anything. But if you today come here and actually just on reflection that you're still struggling with issues of addiction in your life or whatever it is, and you want to be set free, then we'd love to pray for you. We would absolutely love to pray for you. Shall we stand?